okay, introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you were working, your topic, and then ask him your question.
Well, pleasure to meet you, Frank. My name is Kevin, and this is Amir, Jairo, and Hanan. And our project, we were working on the masculinity through military values in the Halo series, through Halo 1 and 5, of course. And we have two questions regarding both the role of women in the game and the humanization of certain characters throughout the Halo series.
Yeah.
Our first question is, we did some, before I ask the question, we did some research, and as you're well aware, in 2009 and 2010, Halo 3 ODST and Halo Reach came out, which were the last games of Bungie, which were normal Halo games throughout told the origin of Master Chief, etc. And then in 2012, I don't know if you were aware, there was what is now called fourth wave feminism, an uprising and feminist movement, where there was protests about sexual harassment in workplace behaviors with women, etc. And in 2012, that was in April, and in November, Halo 4 came out. And in Halo 4, everyone who played it saw a different role in Cortana in the game. Instead of being the quote-unquote assistant, was more a protagonist figure. Now my question is, did any of the feminist movement in 2012 have anything to do with Cortana's protagonism in Halo 4, or was that already planned, or did it have anything to do with it?
There was always a plan. I mean, we announced actually before Halo 1 came out, it's revealed in the story The Fall of Reach that Cortana could endure rampancy or suffer rampancy, which means she's got a 7-year lifespan, and when she reaches that 7-year lifespan, she's going to start changing her behavior for good or bad. So we had already started that clock ticking in 2001 when the first game released. So it was somewhat inevitable, if we were going to follow the seeds that we planted, that we were going to end up in a situation where Cortana went crazy or was threatened with death, or there were multiple ways to resolve that. But the fact is that story really started in 2001. Now, that said, I think that all of us, especially people in my generation, have gone through maybe 20 years of really serious rethinking about what feminism means. In the 1960s, it was a relatively new thing, and it was nascent, and it grew, and it evolved. And I think we certainly just evolved with the times. Just people who are working on the games, the artists and the writers, are trying to represent contemporary themes and ideas. But we didn't deliberately set out to change Cortana's behavior so much as we had already planned on doing that. So the way that we felt about issues like feminism, and more recently the Me Too movement, has been, I think, much more fundamentally making people think very deliberately about decisions that they make. But we always had issues with Cortana in terms of her sexuality anyway, that were not related to how we intended to portray the character, but related to something really arbitrary, which was the improvement in technology. So Cortana starts as almost a sprite-like fairy-type character, as a hologram, and as she became more realistic looking, unfortunately, she became more sexualized. And that wasn't our intent. It was literally just, we have more polygons. And in fact, in Halo 4, we tried to, in some ways, kind of desexualize her by using a real person's body as the frame. So, and it wasn't, a stripper or a dancer or, a barbarian. We tried to use a real physique that from a real woman. But that actually blew up in her faces a little bit, because that making her more realistic really changed the way that people felt about that presentation, which you see by the time we got to Halo 5. We had kind of embraced that was problematic just visually, and that's why she's wearing a uniform effectively, rather than nakedness. And it ties in with there's a coincidental tie-in with her evolution through the story, because by the time you get to Halo 5, she's really a fundamentally different character, and she's liberated from being your assistant. So a lot of it was coincidence. Some of it was just improvements in fidelity. But the staff here has always been feminist in a very It's just a very normal way, not deliberately or as some sort of movement. But we're feminist staff for our males and females, and my boss is a woman. Many of my peers and colleagues are women, and one thing we are doing now is hiring more women. We always tried, but it was hard. But now that STEM is a really big thing for, at least in the mainland, they're pushing STEM as a pathway for women and girls, and so we're getting more candidates, which means better candidates. So it's becoming a little bit easier, but we are very deliberate about that because we need to be perfectly honest, we need the variety of thought and the new ideas that you can get by increasing the variety of people that you have on your staff.
Okay, so the story arc was already decided on Cortana becoming more human. It kind of evolved. It didn't have nothing to do with feminism. Did the release date, because as I mentioned, I don't know if I really said it clearly, but in April 2012 was the feminist movement, and then in November 2012 Halo 4 came out. Was the date of release somewhat coincidental, or was it planned in the sense? Yeah,
it's the way that a video game release schedule works, especially with Halo, is we like to be out at the end of the year, closer to the holiday season, so Thanksgiving and then Christmas, because it's an efficient way to sell more games. And in our case, because we're first party, also to sell more consoles, so we're pushing two things at once. We're pushing the game. So that date was decided. I mean, that date was definitely decided at least at the beginning of the year before. So at least in 2011, and likely in January or February of 2011, because we knew we were going to be shooting for that period, and then we can start to hammer things down as we get closer to it. So that is a coincidence for sure. But again, I think that some of the ways we were starting to think about female characters and empowerment in games started long before that, but evolved with it, and were influenced by it absolutely, just not that release date.
Okay, and my final question to following up on that note, Cortana's humanization. You mentioned how you wanted to evolve her, not make her more of a sex toy. You could say that the things you mentioned she was being portrayed as, you try to make her more human, not this AI. Was her humanization more about her, or was it more about Chief being humanized? Because in the first 3 games, which are the only 3 he appears in, how do you say, he's viewed more as a machine. As a war machine, exactly. He's not viewed as this individual character. He doesn't have this personality per se. Was Cortana's humanization more about her as a character, or was it more about Chief and his character?
It's actually both, and I'll take a step back. We needed Cortana to be more interesting and fulfill the promise of her story arc. As you say, the story isn't really about the Master Chief in some ways. He's kind of a vessel that you pilot through this world to discover the story, obviously just to have gameplay and be empowered in that regard. So there's much more story about Cortana than there ever is about Chief. You can make an argument that he's a camera for the player. And one thing we've been really careful with over the years is to make sure that we're not constantly reminding the player that they're not the Chief. We want the player to be the Chief, whether that's a 15-year-old girl or a 65-year-old man. We don't want to keep reminding them that this is not their heroism. We want them to feel that they're empowered to be a hero in that space. And so the story about Cortana, I mean, it quite carefully avoids things like romance, because it could be a girl playing it, and it could be a parent playing it. It could be someone who doesn't have any interest in romance, like a young man who's more interested in shooting aliens than he is in a romantic plot. And I think if we had made Cortana and Chief's relationship less fraternal and more romantic, I think it would do a disservice to the nature and the history of their relationship. She's there as your friend and colleague, and you said assistant, and absolutely that, certainly in the first games. But as they go through the games, their friendship becomes deeper and deeper, and it's a friendship that doesn't need to be influenced by romance. It's a true loyalty and faithfulness to each other through friendship and fraternity in a way. So.
Yeah. Okay, then Next group, Orlando.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Good day.
Remember, guys, say your names, introduce yourself, and then go ahead.
He's drinking.
Hi. Is my screen frozen with me drinking a can of soda? Great. Sorry. Hopefully it will catch up again and start moving.
My name is Orlando.
My name is Emil.
My name is Luis.
My name is Emmanuel.
Hola.
Yeah. Di la pregunta tuya.
No empiezas tú ahora.
Our question is, did you make some research from any specific army of a country to organize the human army in Halo?
Yes, we try to base it on kind of a combination of the U.S. Navy, the British Navy, and the Marines. So everything that happens in the military is under the aegis of a kind of naval doctrine. So much of the universe involves travel. The correct analog is a naval analog. It's fleets of ships. It's deployment of ground forces are deployed like Marines and so on. So that's the main thing. We've made some adjustments for story reasons. We've tried to modernize some things. We've made the Office of Naval Intelligence is actually a real department in the U.S. Navy, but we've changed it to be more like the CIA or something like that. So we absolutely borrow from real places. And so our salutes, our uniforms, even rules about things like having a beard come from contemporary Navy and historical naval organizations. But we make exceptions. There is technically an Army and an Air Force in Halo. You never really see them, or they are deployed from the Navy. So.
Frank, excuse me for a second. The image froze again. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. I can't.
Okay.
It frozen is super embarrassing.
It's not a big deal because we can hear you just fine. Just so you know.
Yeah, I know. I can see it. Trying again. I can still hear you though.
Okay, perfect. Then, Emil,
Okay.
may continue.
The next question. In the Halo franchise, where there
Emil,
was
get close to the camera because he cannot see you.
Oh, I can see it. There you go.
in the Halo franchise, where there was a political message to all of the stories?
Not really. I think in some ways our stories about and our deep extended fiction, the novels and stuff. The one theme that it goes throughout it is what happens to diaspora of humans. What happens when we expand out into new frontiers? What are the dangers? Who do we meet when we expand our empire, as it were? So there's a little bit of that, but we want to tell a story that is, to be honest, kind of wholesome and family oriented as well. So we're not trying to put in too much political depth. I mean, there's some exceptions to that. The Arbiter being your friend is kind of a Noam Chomsky thing, and we do try to show that the Covenant aren't just thoughtless aliens, and that they have a society and a culture that's worth respecting and saving. So by the time you get to Halo 5 and we're mostly at peace, we have a lot more in common with the Covenant than when we started. So certainly things like that, but we weren't trying to make analogs to the Gulf War or anything like that. We just wanted to tell a story that was built from its own background, rather than trying to I think complicate things by bringing in and to be honest, by bringing in controversial politics. We want to tell a story that's fun and empowering and exciting, and not necessarily burdened by deeper sort of political themes. They absolutely are in there. They tend to come in from the occasional line dialogue. It's the way that our artists envision the graphics and so on. So there's definitely politics in it, like there is in any big ensemble production, because you bring in the politics and feelings of your staff. They're represented in the art.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, next group. The third group. Pega esa silla más para acá, para que él te vea.
Echa la silla para.
Closer. Claudia, vente acá. Ah, ya lo te veo. Okay, perfect.
Vente,
Okay,
sí.
introduce yourself and
Hi, I'm Andrea, Claudia, Paola,
Francis.
Our research was about militarization, and we were wondering what inspired the game producers to make the conflict about human race versus alien race rather than human on human conflict.
So our backstory, the origin story of the Spartans, and this is again in the extended fiction and novels and stuff, and this is something we'll touch on in the Showtime TV series, deals with colonial insurrection. So the human colony worlds started to feel that they were being either abandoned or abused by the Earth government, and rebelled. So the Spartans were originally designed to go and quell or stop those kind of insurrection activities in the outer colonies. Then, when we encountered the Covenant, we now had an existential threat. So that part of the story is about how our former rebels and insurrectionists gathered together to fight a greater foe, which is absolutely an analog for something that happened in World War II. And World War II is actually a pretty good metaphor for what our story is, because World War II has such a breadth of types of story that you could tell almost any kind of story at all in that setting. So it could be a romance or a love story between two shipping clerks in the Navy. It could be a man abandoned on a desert island in the South Pacific. There were so many stories and so many sort of cultural clashes in that war, but also the thing that we had most in common was all these countries banding together to fight evil. World War II is a very strange war because a lot of wars aren't good guys versus bad guys. You know, a lot of wars are just people versus people, and they just don't agree on some territorial or financial or political dispute. But World War II was an evil force, had aligned itself with other evil forces to literally to try and dominate and take over the world, and we don't have to talk about the Holocaust, but they were bad guys. So that's a good analog for us, because we wanted to make sure that when you're fighting people, you're fighting them for a good, simple, clean, ethical reason. And again, it isn't mired in politics or nuance. It's good guys versus bad guys. So that was the reason. And Aliens made for good bad guys. And eventually, as the story progresses, we explore and say it's not that simple. You know, they're not all bad guys, and we get to explore their culture a little bit through that lens. But there's some gameplay reasons. A lot of the decisions we make when we're making a game have nothing to do with story, but in the case of the Covenant, it's so that if you're looking, 500 yards across the field, you can recognize a bad guy by his silhouette. Right, so these things all drive design and content, and it's sometimes about shapes and colors as well as the story. So that's true in most games. Is there's decisions that are made for sometimes compromised reasons, but sometimes really good technical or gameplay reasons.
Okay, and our second question would be, do you think Halo reflects the aggressive nature of humans, and does it reflect a future militarization in our society?
Halo, one thing that is true in Halo is that our culture that we expose in the games, certainly, if you read the comics and other novels and stuff, you see more than that, but it's a military-industrial complex, and that more so in our story, the Earth and its colonies are much more capitalist and, I guess, contemporary at the early stages of this, and it really, once the Covenant is established as this, existential threat, the military complex takes over governance. So there's the United Earth government, but really they're run by the UNSC, which is obviously the naval forces, and the UNSC in some ways is controlled by the Office of Naval Intelligence. So our tree of command during the war looks kind of like, a modern day example would be like if the CIA was running the army and the army was running the government. And capitalism is still happening. There's private businesses and the military-industrial complex to supply weapons and vehicles and so on. But once the Covenant arrived, it stops being about that kind of capitalist machinery and more about the efficiency of trying to fight a greater threat. They're on a war footing, and the military-industrial complex is, at its peak during those times, and that's in our game. that's absolutely in our game. And again, there's more nuanced stories in the novels and stuff, but it's hard to do that kind of political ambiguity in a video game where you're, you know, flying a spaceship or shooting lasers.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much.
Okay, the fourth group over here.